Okay, that is going. And then I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you guys see a Canva presentation? You can see my screen or no? Yeah, okay. I'm gonna go into present mode. And then I have to be honest, I don't use WebEx very often, so I'm having a moment of kind of technological adjustment here. Okay. Can you guys just confirm by unmuting yourself that you can see the screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
I can see it.
We can see it.
Guys,
I can see it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dive in. First of all, welcome to this inaugural Lerner learning series, the virtual version, if you will, as everything is right now. We today are talking about posture, alignment, and movement, which is something, as some of you know, Emma, I'm looking at you, this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I love talking about alignment and biomechanics, so I'm really excited to share with you guys today. Let me think if I had other housekeeping stuff before we dive in. As I said, feel free, if you have a question in the middle of the presentation, please interrupt. Don't feel like be an active participant in this, treat it like a workshop. You don't need to treat this like a lecture where you don't really have your voice. So that's one thing. And then the last thing I want to say is my general plan for this is we'll do about somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes of the presentation, depending on how quickly we move. Then we'll do maybe 10 or 15 minutes of some small exercises. It's not anything rigorous or, you know, you're not going to break a sweat. It's not a HIIT workout. And then I'll leave a bunch of time at the end for questions. So this is the ideal timing, and you know, of course, we shall see what actually happens. So, as I said, posture, alignment, and movement. We're going to dive right in. So, what we'll be talking about today are highlights. I'm going to give a brief introduction of myself, my background, my interests, how I got into this kind of nitty-gritty alignment stuff. Then we're going to dive into, like, what is the point? Why do we care about our posture at all for our movement? Like, does it really matter that much? We'll then talk about some alignment concepts and tools. We'll pivot into talking about fascia, which is a connective tissue in the body, how it influences posture, how it also influences movement. And then finally, we'll kind of tie it all together by talking about the postures we take in our movement. And of course, we'll end with some things, exercises, not that you know, take or leave them, but that have been helpful tools for me in any movement practice, kind of finding what is optimal for my body. And we've got this little seedling here because I like to think of posture as this big root system that we've got going at the bottom. So it's kind of this foundational thing. If we can have a robust, strong posture, then everything else will grow above it. Also, just a heads up, I should have said this on the first slide, but I can't see you right now. So if somebody has a question or has posted a question in the chat, you guys can always just kind of unmute yourself and let me know. So let's dive in. So a little bit about me. My name, as I said, is Meredith. I'm a second-year MPH student at Milken. I'm in the Global Environmental Health track. I have my 200-hour yoga teacher training certification in lit yoga, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. And I teach that style of yoga at Lerner, at Hellwell, depending on what you know it by. My deeper background, I was a dancer. I've been dancing since I was 5 or so. So that was kind of my window into movement. And I studied ballet. So in ballet, big focuses on alignment and kind of the nitty-gritty details of how we're holding our structure. So that kind of paved the path for me to dive in a little bit more robustly as I've gotten older. So a little bit about lit yoga. This is a style of yoga that was developed by a physical therapist. Her name is Laura Hyman. She would label this system functional yoga, because the goal is really to work on functional movement patterns that can help us in our day-to-day lives. So we're not really just working on poses that you would only do in a yoga class. Instead, we're working on skills that we need every day to feel good, to feel strong. So she kind of fused some of her functional PT concepts with a yoga format. That being said, of course, I'm coming from this yoga lens, but today I do really want to broaden this into a conversation about alignment in all movement. I'm not just going to be talking about yoga postures or yoga flows, but more of these foundational concepts that help even in just walking around the world. So as I said, we're going to talk about this. Why do we care, right? Like, what's the point? For me, posture is the starting line. And when I say the starting line, I mean, when we have optimal posture, you see this track photo we've got here. Optimal posture places us right at the starting line. We're ready to start moving, run a race, get something done. But we show up with posture that sets our bodies up to work efficiently, intelligently, quickly, then you will start your race right at the starting line. However, if we are not holding our bodies in that kind of optimal place in those positions, we start to drop back. So it's like before you can even start your race or your movement, you have to make up the 20 feet you lost in the kind of suboptimal posture. And I never want to label it as bad. We are all working on our alignment. This stuff is hard. So don't take it harshly as if I'm, wagging a finger at you. But there are ways that we can prime the body to be most ready for movement, which I would consider having optimal posture. And then when you start falling out of those places, and we'll talk about what those are later, that's when we start to have to make up ground before we can even start running the race. So it's like starting the race 20 feet behind the starting line. So posture to me is really the foundation of all of our movement practices. And movement is a process of transferring energy. It can be either transferring energy through different parts of the body, meaning like the muscles are firing and it's, pulling on different things to move the body. But it also can be energy transference from the ground. So we're walking around, we're bipedal animals. Maybe you're on your hands as well. We get energy kind of like this equal and opposite reaction up from the ground as we're moving. And if we're in a place of optimized posture, we can really efficiently transfer that energy through our bodies. Whereas if we're kind of deviating from what our healthy normal is, the energy starts to hit blocks and then it kind of becomes wasted. It's like if you had a tube and you were trying to shoot something through it and then suddenly you bent the tube and kind of had it, so there had to be this weird hairpin turn in it, that's going to slow down whatever you're trying to move through the tube. So posture, I think, is a window to get really efficient movement and efficient use of the energy that we're kind of cultivating every day. So now let's move into, we're talking about this so much, but what actually is, good alignment or optimal posture? Like, what are things we can look for? So we'll go through these three concepts, and this is just the start. I mean, I think I could do like a 7-hour-a-day series on different kind of nitty-gritty stuff with alignment, but we're going to do an overview today. You're lucky for that. So we'll talk about the plumb line, which is an imaginary line we use to quickly assess somebody's posture. We're going to talk about spinal curves. The spine is naturally an S-shaped curve, and we'll talk about why is that and why do we want to protect that curve. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, we'll talk about the importance of the pelvis. If you see on our skeleton friend over on the right side, it's a really key site where we've got the lower half of the body meeting the upper half. And there's so much energy transference happening there. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll also talk about some common deviations that people might struggle with, which would be anterior or posterior tilt of the pelvis. So let's get into the plumb line. If we see our friendly cartoon on the right here, you'll see that the body is kind of bisected by this dashed line. So the plumb line is a tool that a lot of, biomechanics analysis people use to quickly see if someone is deviating in certain areas in their posture. So ideally, for most people, and it's, nothing is ever black and white, there's always some exception to some rules. Optimal posture for most people, this line would run through the ear, it would run through the center of the shoulder joint, it would run through the middle of the hip joint, so you can see that here, the middle of the knee joint, and the middle of the ankle joint. This one does not have the ankle fully lined up. So like I said, there's always some slight deviation. We're not going to be kind of these cardboard cutout perfect things. But this plumb line can give you a good sense of where you're at baseline. So it's a great tool that we can use when looking at other people, but also when looking at ourselves. And it is usually done with people turned to the side. So you would do it on one side of the body. Does anybody have questions? You can unmute if you do. I'm just going to pause for a second to give you some space. Okay, cool. I'll keep going. Oh, okay. I was worried the photo wasn't going to load. So here is a real world example of how I have used the plumb line in my own life. So this photo was taken during my yoga teacher training. We talked a lot about posture. The photo on the left was the day I walked in, and the photo on the right is 3 days later. And I've drawn these sample plumb lines here. So I would love, if we have a brave soul, somebody to unmute and tell me what you see between these two photos. What is different?
You're leaning forward in the first one.
Hey, we got an expert. Amazing. I don't know who that was, but yes, you are exactly right. So we can see, especially in the head, like my ear is way in front of this line. And you can almost tell like how that energy is kind of slumping forward, I think. Now in the second photo, I would argue that my shoulder might be a little bit overcorrected behind the line. But again, like we are all working in real time all the time, and it doesn't just fix itself overnight. So here is a really great way that you can use this tool to kind of get a quick assessment of where your posture is at, just at baseline, at standing. And it can, once you draw that line in and really create the visual for yourself, it can be very revealing what areas are deviating, and then you'll know kind of what work to move forward with. So that's the plumb line. Moving into discussion of spinal curves, and of course all of these things are related, but as I mentioned before, the spine has a naturally S-shaped curve. So we can see in this highlighted spooky skeleton on the right, we've got a thoracic spinal curve there and a lumbar and cervical spine curve that are in the opposite direction. Technically, the coccyx matches the thoracic curve, but we've got this nice even curvature. So those curves are providing support, and they're really like a huge part of our body's ability to absorb shock. So when we're moving, when we're jumping, when we're running, having preserving our curves is very important. Which is, and it works in both ways. So sometimes I think when we try to work towards optimal posture, we get in our heads that we need to have a stick straight spine, and that's not actually true. You do want to honor these natural parts of the body, but what we start getting concerned about are when we overly curve, like here, this would be called kyphosis as it's labeled, where the thoracic spine is really curving back in space. You probably would have a caved in chest. Maybe the head would be held forward. Or lordosis, which is a really extreme sway in the low back. And these types of, kind of extreme versions of our natural curves start to make us very vulnerable to injury, just when we're standing, just when we're existing in the world. And then when you add additional challenges in movement, or you load your body, you know, if you're doing weights or something, that's when we really kind of start to increase the likelihood that we will get injured or that the movement won't be sustainable over time. This is probably my favorite topic, I have to say. If you've ever taken one of my lit yoga classes, I talk about the glutes nonstop, and the pelvis is the reason why. So as I mentioned before, the pelvis is just massively influential for our overall posture and our movement. And to me, the way I conceptualize this is, I put these photos here to demonstrate. You can see all of these different muscles that attach to the pelvis in various places. So this view would be from the front. We've got the huge psoas muscle running down across the pelvis. We've got the iliacus. We have all of these, adductors, but inner thigh muscles. And then we take the view from the side, and we have all of our tiny but very important external rotators of the hip. We've got these are views of the same muscles as this, just from the side. Hamstring muscles are coming in here. And then when we look from the back, we've got the huge glute muscles, big motors. There are 3 of those gluteus muscles. So when I look at this, there are an insane number of muscular attachments on this one bony structure and area of the body. And at the same time, they're running in a bunch of different directions. So what that tells me is the pelvis is constantly a site of like push and pull and energy transference, moving that energy, like I mentioned when we started, from the ground through the limbs, all the way at this key kind of transference point up to where it needs to go to keep kind of us strong and moving. So pelvis is just like such a motor because of all of the activity that's happening there muscularly. Not to mention it kind of nests our like deep core muscles here, which of course are important. So really key for energy transference is the position of the pelvis. And basically what we've been talking about so far is all of our sort of bony structures, right? Our skeletal structure. So we want our skeletal structure to be optimized to let our muscles work the most efficiently, which is, again, like a huge part of this discussion of why posture matters. If we can get the bones in the right place, the muscles will do their job and will show up for us. You know, we'll have to put some work in. Of course, it's not a done deal, but the bones are kind of the first step in optimizing the way the muscles work. So I said we would talk a little bit about, you know, deviations with the pelvis, and I'm going to focus more on one than the other. So because of the way modern life is structured, we sit a lot, we're on phones a lot. Really the sitting is the biggest thing. We don't move usually in a variety of directions or planes. Modern life makes it really hard to maintain a neutral pelvis. Just the nature of sitting a lot is going to bias the front of the hip to be tighter and your glute region, the back of the pelvis, to be weaker. And those glutes are a key part of keeping the pelvis from tipping forward or back. So I'm going to focus more on anterior tilt, which we see here on the right side. And that's purely because this is the most common challenge people have with the pelvis. So in anterior tilt, essentially the pelvic bowl, or what we would just call, you know, the 2 halves of your pelvis, starts to dip forward. It's almost like the analogy I've always been taught is, imagine your pelvis, you know, picture that bony structure. Imagine you filled it with juice or water or wine, and then imagine you started tipping it away from you, and that juice or water or wine would just spill out the front. So we lose a lot of energy when our pelvis starts to tip. And as this graphic kind of outlines here, you start to get weakened but taut. So probably people might feel discomfort from that type of tautness. Weakened core muscles or anterior muscles in the front. You get short and tight hip flexors because we're kind of shortening the distance between the front of the pelvis and the attachment down by the knee. And then at the same time, we start to scrunch up the low back, and we get a lot of aggravated lumbar spine issues, low back issues down there. Again, and then, the hamstrings are having a similar issue as the core, where they're lengthened, but they're not stretchy, they're not supple. They're just held in a long position, and that often feels aggravating, and it also weakens the muscle itself. So anterior tilt is the thing that we see most commonly in our world today. The opposite would be posterior tilt, and that would take this diagonal we've got through the body here and just flip it. So it would come from higher in the front and be lower in the back. So you would actually see, I'm going to stand up and do it. I don't know if you can see my video, but you see a bit of a curve, kind of a concave in the front body, and then a lengthening in the back body, exactly the opposite of anterior tilt. It's much less common, but for both instances, what is key is having a great balance between core strength and activated glutes. So using the musculature of the glutes, and it can be tough because when the bones are out of alignment, it's harder to get the glutes to wake up. But the kind of easiest fix, if you will, to anterior tilt would be turn those glutes on and try to get the pelvis back to this neutral position, and then all movement will become so much more efficient. Before we head into this section, any questions? Again, I'll be silent. Feel free to unmute yourself. No questions?
Yeah, what's the back pain related to the pelvic floor?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so generally my thought would be, are you talking about low back pain?
Yes, low back.
Yeah, so the pelvic floor is a key deep abdominal muscle. And I think when the pelvis starts to dip in this direction or deviate at all, maybe tightening the low back, to me it's a signal that probably those deepest abdominal muscles aren't necessarily activating. So like the glutes, the deep pelvic floor, which for people who don't know kind of lines the inner base of the pubic or of the pelvis. That can be a muscle that when it's working can almost create another layer of shock absorption, or kind of, it's like a supple, it's not always held taut, but it contracts and releases throughout the day to kind of keep everything lifted. So I think what I would say, and of course without seeing someone, I can't say this for sure, but probably if the pelvis is dipping, that means the entire core is not optimally activated, and then you would feel a lot of that load in the low back because it's shortened. You're basically calling on those muscles to like carry the stabilizing energy, when what we want to do is bring more of the front body, the core, and that pelvic floor area into the conversation, get all of those working together, and then that takes some of the load off of the low back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe.
I know it's complicated and it's a lot. And again, I'm wary of telling you something super specific because, I've never seen you move or anything. I'm also not a medical practitioner, so I never want to tell people like this is the answer. But generally, I think with pelvic floor and glutes, they are and the core, they're all related. Like you want them all to be working in harmony, and ultimately that's what will give the most relief to the low back. But that's a great question. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you've neglected this for many years having a sitting job and you have long and taut and weak and short and tight, is there hope for,
There's hope.
oh, there's hope.
Go ahead and finish.
Okay.
Go ahead and finish.
Great.
Yeah, we'll talk about some exercises and I think easy to implement tools in your everyday life that you can use. And yeah, thank you for saying that, because I don't want anyone to be hearing this and feel discouraged, like, oh gosh, my posture isn't optimal and I'm never going to feel, as best as I could. There is hope, and these things, I think, with consistency, you will see big improvements and you will feel improvements. So, yes, like I work with my mom. She has worked at a seated desk job her whole life. She's in her 60s. And, I've made her a little plan to kind of start moving things in the right direction. And it doesn't happen immediately, but keep the hope. Don't get down on yourself, certainly. And then at the end, of course, we'll talk about those exercises that are helpful.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next kind of wave. So we just talked a lot about the bony structure of the body, where we want to place all of these pieces of the skeleton optimally, the plumb line as a way to kind of see what's going on. This next layer is a lot more about connective tissue. So we're going to talk about fascia. It's also called the myofascia. It depends on what authority you are reading from, essentially. So the fascia, I think, is an often neglected aspect of our bodies, but it's essentially a network of all of the in-between connective tissue in the body, and it has a really big influence on posture and movement. And maybe influence is not even the right word. The relationship between fascia, posture, and movement is very intertwined. So when I say it's a connective tissue, it is not a connective tissue like a tendon or a ligament, something that's connecting a joint. Instead, it's almost more like if you see, when you look at photos from kind of anatomy labs or autopsies, it almost looks more like cellophane or cling wrap. And that it's a network all throughout the body that actually connects each individual muscle to the muscles around them. So we are never moving in isolation because of this fascia network. My favorite image to think about with fascia is that the organs are fish, jellyfish, different sea creatures, and the ocean itself is the fascia. So all movement that's happening in a muscle doesn't happen in complete isolation, even though we often talk about it that way. So we've got the fascia, and again, why do we care, right? It's just connective tissue filling up space. Who cares? But we do care because, as I said, muscles are not moving in isolation. And we have to start thinking about the whole body as like a synergistic one thing. So things that are happening in our neck with our posture could very well affect things that happen way further down the line, like in our hips. And I think the fascial system in our bodies and the state of our fascia can drive some of this effort to find more optimal positioning for our bodies. And it's kind of a two-sided situation. So if we have really restricted fascia, which would mean that connective tissue isn't supple, it doesn't want to move very much, that might make it very hard to move the body into a more optimal posture. But conversely, the way we get fascia to become more supple is through movement. So it literally absorbs water through the act of moving it around in this kind of like gliding motion. So it's kind of this push and pull in my head of restricted fascia might make it feel hard to move, but moving will help open up the fascia. So it is, I think, really a key part of having great alignment in movement. And again, like if we're moving in suboptimal ways or standing in suboptimal ways, that can be something that leads to areas of restriction in this fascial network. A kind of more tangible example than me just spewing these words at you, a lot of us have really tight fascial lines in this back region. So from the back of the head all the way down to the back of the hips. And sometimes if you do a class that starts to open up some of the low back fascia, and maybe you're using the core more, you're getting some gentle stretching there, you might feel relief all the way up in the neck and vice versa. So sometimes getting some more mobility in the neck will relieve some stuff in other regions. So to me, fascia is an unspoken, we emphasize musculature a lot when we talk about movement, but there's this other piece that's really influencing things as well. And I just wanted to touch on this, but it's through movement that we start to open some of these restricted areas up. Sometimes it's more the fascia than it is the muscle that is restricting a certain movement. So I'm just going to summarize before we move into posture and movement. So far, we've talked about posture is key to safe, sustainable movement, for that energy transference, for our efficiency, for our strength. Optimal skeletal alignment is key for strength and efficiency. It's like I touched on earlier. When we get our bones aligned in the place that they're happiest, all the muscles will be placed perfectly to kind of wake up and do their jobs, with some work from us, of course. And then finally, movement is really a hydrating force for the fascia, these connective tissues, and gentle movement and starting to wake that kind of tissue up into a more supple state will help with feeling restricted in our bodies. So we're now moving into more of the, that was a deep dive on some of the more stable posture stuff. We're going to move into kinetic or motion a little bit more. So this is one of my favorite concepts. It's called the kinetic chain of mobility and stability. And essentially, based on the way that our skeletons are made, the different structures in the skeleton, alternating parts of our body, alternating sections or joints, I guess is how I would qualify this. These alternating joints want to be stable, and then the opposite ones want to be mobile. So you'll see here, contrary to what we often are taught, the cervical spine wants to be relatively stable based on the structure of those vertebrae in the cervical spine. Right below it, we've got a mobile joint, the thoracic spine. We get tons of rotation in the thoracic spine, bending side to side, and we can even extend, which would be like a back bend. Again, big contrary to a lot of our kind of cultural understanding, the lumbar spine, in terms of its structure, it wants to be stable. So we often will see pictures of people bending in a really deep back bend or something, and you see a lot of the low back taking a hit. But this low back wants to be stable. It feels best when it's stable. And again, that's based on the actual form of the bony vertebrae of the lumbar spine. Next up, we've got the hip. Super mobile joint, ball and socket. You can move in lots of directions. Sandwich next to the knee, which again wants to be more stable. And finally, we've got the ankle, which wants to be more mobile. So if we think about this concept in combination with our kind of optimized posture, like our optimized placement, movement becomes a lot more sustainable, because we're not loading areas of the body that are not designed to take a big range of motion, and instead we can concentrate on optimizing the range of motion in areas that are structurally designed to do that. So this concept to me and this image has always been really, really helpful in understanding that we can't be fully only mobile in every section of our bodies. It's not healthy for us, or it's not sustainable. I think when you're 20, you can get away with a lot, but for the most part, we want to be mindful of these areas of the body that are happiest when they're really supported and kind of more on the stable side. And that doesn't mean immobile, but just scaled back a little. So keep moving forward. This is, to me, the first instance, and we'll practice this in a bit, of a super successful tool of checking in with our posture easily every single day. If you've taken classes with me, you can cover your ears, you know this, but I'll go through it anyway. It's called the triple S. And the triple S stands for sacrum, scapula, and skull. So in this concept, and this comes straight out of lit yoga, an easy way to check in with your posture throughout the day is to try to align these three S sections of the body. So the sacrum is at the back of the pelvis, and again, we are going to, at the end, get up and practice this. The scapula is the shoulder blade. Oh, wow, look at, I left this in here. I'm so sorry, you guys. You can laugh. I hope you're laughing at me because I'm laughing at me right now. Anyway, so the sacrum is the back of the pelvis. The scapula are the shoulder blades right on the back of the rib cage. And the skull, we're specifically talking about this kind of blue-green area here. They're called the suboccipital condyles. And you can feel them if you go in with your fingers right where the top of the neck meets the base of the skull. You feel these bumpy, bony structures. These are ideally what we're lining up with the scapula and the sacrum to create this quick triple S alignment. I think that will make also more sense once we get in our bodies, which we'll do in just a bit. Okay, so this is a little understanding this concept of having triple S alignments, the back of the skull, scapula, sacrum in line. I wanted to give some examples of some stuff we see online of, squat positions. And again, if there are any brave souls out there, I would love if you would unmute and kind of quickly say, if you see triple S in these, if not, what seems like it might be a little bit askew. And if you don't know, that's fine. I'm happy to talk about it. I recognize at this moment you have not had a good example of a solid triple S, but let's see where you're at. No takers? It's okay, I'll talk about it. So looking at these 3 photos, and this is not to shame anyone or do anything, it's purely an exercise of looking at a body and thinking about what might be a safer position for them to be in. Let's start in the middle here. I don't think the back is, too bad here, but I do see this neck really kind of punching out of alignment here. So if we had triple S, we'd have the sacrum here. We have the scapula kind of moving on the upward diagonal here. Ideally, the back of the skull would be almost where his ear is. So we get those 3 things in line. He might have a little bit of tip in his pelvis there. But what I noticed first on him is that the head is way up. Moving over to the right, I think it's a very similar story. The first thing I see is the neck here. I think she also maybe has a little bit, again, of some curving in the spine going on. Might need a little bit more core support. But then we look over at her standing position, and I see here's her sacrum, and her shoulder blades or her scapula are way behind the sacrum. So I'm thinking she might have some lower back pain, and the scapula might serve her better if they were moved forward a bit, and she was a bit more stacked there. She'd have better energy transfer and core activation. And really, this one on the left is a very similar story. It's a bit of an arched back and lifted head. Again, I'm not shaming anyone. I don't believe in that. But I do believe that we all can kind of be assessing where we're at all times. So now, of course, near and dear to my heart is the triple S in yoga, trying to align these 3 sections of the body. And it's often not a priority in yoga. I think especially in Western yoga, we really emphasize the spine working in ways that maybe it is not optimized to do. So again, I'll pause and I'm going to give you guys a second. If you want to say something about what you see, please do. Otherwise, I'm happy to do a quick little, this is what I'm seeing. Okay, I'm going to go in. So down here we see, you know, skull and scapula are pretty good, but sacrum's way back. And obviously she's doing, you know, a specific movement. But this is a good example of big curvature happening in the spine there. Up here at the top, we've got a big back bend. And there, you know, of course, when you're moving in more extreme ranges, you're not always going to have all three of these things aligned. But here we see a lot of kind of the low back's taking a lot of load, the sacrum's way in here, the scapula are above it, but we've got a lot of curve between those two, and then the head is just kind of released. So that's deviating. Again, if there's, you know, reason that that's happening, I'm not going to say you should never do that, but something to think about. And then here I see a little bit of a rounded sacrum. You see a little bit of rounding in the spine, some dipping in the shoulder blades. So you can see almost like her armpits are falling towards the floor slightly, just slightly. And then a little bit of lift in the head. So we've got a little bit more curve than ideally for triple S we would want to see for this concept. So now we're going to get into some alignment exercises. I'm going to speak through them first, and then we will do them. So these are, like I said, quick things you can implement in your life when you're stationary, also when you're moving, to help you kind of figure out where you're at in space. The first we'll go through is the triple S, so that will start to make more sense to you. The second we're going to talk about is using our hands to understand what's happening in our body. And the third tool, and we're not going to do this together, but talking about the power of video and photo. So just like you saw the photo of me from my yoga training, you can take photos of yourself in different positions. I suggested, you know, standing from the side so you can draw that plumb line, your plank, your forward fold or a squat, as a quick way to see what your habits are and where you naturally are showing up, or how you're naturally showing up, and where you might be able to kind of bring a little bit more oomph into in order to get more into this optimal place. My final thing, and there's no good way in a virtual setting to do this, but I want to think about your work or study space. I know someone on the call works at a desk, is seated all day. So really think about how you might be able to, using everyday objects, optimize your space to help you have better posture. For example, I'm going to go through what I do. I use a laptop for work. I have my laptop propped up on some books. I use some yoga blocks, but you can use books or maybe a crate so that I look at the screen at eye level. That way I don't have to drop my head while I'm working. So that's one thing that's great. The second thing I've done is I use a wireless mouse. And this allows me to keep my shoulders in place instead of having to reach forward while my laptop is up and use the scroll pad. The third thing that I really like is I got a Bluetooth keyboard. It wasn't too expensive. And if this is a barrier for you, it's okay. Like, do not kill yourself over this. But I got a separate keyboard, and again, that allows me to keep my shoulders, my scapula in line with my skull and my sacrum, the back of my pelvis, instead of having to lean forward to type on my computer. So my big things for my space were elevating the screen so that I'm not looking down all the time, getting those separate little pieces of tech so that I could keep more of my upper body where I want it to be, and then, of course, take some light movement breaks throughout the day. That's a big thing. I'm just going to move to the next slide just so that my contact info is up. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll get into some of these movement exercises. So we'll do these all together. The first one I'm going to do with my computer here, and then I'll move the computer so that you can have a different view. But for this first one, and if you just want to watch, that's okay too. Don't feel pressure. We're going to practice the triple S, and our best friend for the triple S is the wall. So let me move my chair out of the way. I wish you could see this from the side, but in my apartment, I kind of have limited space to work with. So We are going to use our wall as our kind of metric to see if we're keeping the triple S spots, which would be skull, sacrum, scapula, to see if those are in line. And again, if you've done my classes, I know you've done this before, but it's always a good one. So first things first, let's locate our sacrum. So put your hands on the rim of your pelvis where you can feel the bones, the ischium and the ilium. So once you've got that, trace this part of the pelvis, or even if you're tracing an imaginary, like in an imaginary way, that's fine, and come to the back. And you might feel these two kind of knobby sections of the back. Those are still part of the pelvis. But right in between those two knobs, and just maybe an inch down, this is your sacrum. And it's a pretty broad bone. It's slightly different in males and females, but it's kind of like, honestly, this is a little crude, but it's like an inch or two above your butt crack usually. I'm sorry. I usually try to go for it the other way, but that's a quick way to find it. So this is the sacrum. And then let's take a second, just take the left hand and see if you can just tap your shoulder blade. And then maybe move your arm forward and back. And see if you can feel that shoulder blade moving on the back. So that's our second S, our scapula. And then our third S, we've got, as we discussed earlier, the very base of the skull, those little knobby bones, suboccipital condyles, but we will just call it skull for now. So we are going to try to get all three of these up on the wall. Up meaning just against the wall. So head to a wall, or again, if you want to watch, that's fine. You can also do this on the floor. First things first, I would prioritize the sacrum. So you can walk your feet maybe 6 inches, even a foot more away from the wall. Bend your knees as much as you need to. And really feel that sacrum pressing into the wall. And we emphasize the sacrum so much because this is a quick neutral pelvis position. When we've got a straight sacrum, we know the pelvis is neutral. So feel what that's like. You can practice, kind of play around with where you need your feet to be to get that sacrum on the wall. You do not have to have heels to the wall. And then let's try for 2. So we have to lean back slightly and try to draw those shoulder blades onto the wall. And if you have a tight chest or a rounded upper back, this might be really hard. And that is okay. Be gentle with yourself. But what that tells you is that maybe some chest opening would be beneficial and some strengthening of the back muscles. So we've got those scapula on the wall, we've got the sacrum. And then at the same time, try to kind of pull the front of the rib cage back in space. That's like, that's tougher. It's tough to get the ribs to stay there in this position. But so far we've got sacrum, scapula, we'll focus on that. And the last piece is this base of the skull. And you might find as you try to pull that base of the skull to the wall, that you have to really draw your chin into your throat. And if you can't get your head back, that's okay. Again, be gentle with yourself, start slowly. But the first part is kind of knowing where we're at. So just take a second, close your eyes, and take a second to sense what this feels like. Like, where is it hard, maybe, or effortful? Do you feel any relief? Like for me, doing this with my skull, I feel the back of my neck is much happier. And then ever so gently, try to push yourself away from the wall and try to keep that positioning. So you might have to bend the knees a little bit, but just trying to get those 3 things in line. And then this part about using the hands will come in now. So we can use our hands almost like a proxy wall to help get us into triple S. So say, you're walking about the world, you can't just like walk up to a building and stand against it to check where you're at. So we're gonna use our hands to do a little check-in. So bring your left hand behind the pelvis, right at the sacrum. Imagine that was kind of your wall. And we'll bring our right hand right to the base of the skull, that area we've been caring about. And try to draw the skull back into the right hand and sense that you can align your left hand with your right, like stacking them in space. And for many of us, just that shift of the head back is going to be a huge piece of kind of starting to right our posture. And again, it's just a symptom of our modern day life. I'm going to do one more triple S exercise on the floor, and then I'll give you guys some space to ask questions. I'm happy to stick around until after 7, but I want to respect your time, so do not feel like you have to stay. So I'm just going to close your eyes because I'm going to move my computer. And I've got my yoga mat on the floor here. I'm going to give you just one more exercise. I find it very helpful to use the floor as my wall for these type of triple S exercises. So you can have the knees up to the ceiling and lay all the way back and play with trying to get the shoulder blades on the floor. But primarily your focus should be getting that sacrum all the way on the floor. So if you feel like that, your sacrum's really pulling up from the ground, you're probably more inclined to anterior tilt. And you can start trying to use the front body, pulling the front body into the back body to get that sacrum down. So you can feel this, and then keeping the pelvis exactly where it is with the back of the sacrum on the ground, feeling that kind of tautness in the front body. You can bring the right knee over the hip. So we're in hip flexion here without moving the pelvis. And then lower that foot and lift the left knee over the hip. And lower that foot. And you can just walk this little kind of low bridge here and get a sense of if your pelvis wants to move here, and instead try to keep it as stable as possible and really isolate the movement to the joint instead of the pelvis. So that's another nice kind of pelvic check-in that I like to do. So with these last 5 minutes, I'm going to open it up to you all. Your questions, or you can share takeaways. The floor is yours. Also, if you don't have questions, you're free to hop off at any point. But I've really appreciated everybody coming in. This is, it's a little bit, it's very nitty gritty and kind of, it can be very granular. But I think when we start to apply it in our lives and embody it, it starts to click more and more over time.
I have a question. Hi. Okay, so when you sleep, is it healthier for your back to sleep flat with just one pillow, or?
Yeah, sleeping is so hard, but I'm glad you asked about it because, we spend 8 hours in that position, so it is impactful, or it can be. Generally, ideally, what I have heard for the keeping that curve of the spine while you sleep, sleeping on your side with pillow under the head. Potentially you can hold a pillow in between your arms and then a pillow in between your knees is like the ideal. So that will keep the knees from knocking in, which would move your hips into internal rotation. If you have broad shoulders, holding the pillow will kind of keep them in place. And obviously you want a pillow that's optimized for height in terms of keeping the ear in line. That's a lot of pillows, a little bit fussy, I would say. Another route you could take with getting that is, have you ever seen the infinity pillows that pregnant women use? They're kind of like a big curve shape. You can use that actually and kind of hug it as you sleep and put your head under it, and then the bottom can go between your knees, and that is also getting you in that same position. So ideally it's that, but I think sleeping on the back would be totally fine. My gut reaction in terms of how many pillows, if you're sleeping on your back, how many pillows to use, I would say stick with one. But that's just, that's me. You know your body. If you're waking up feeling great and you're using 2 pillows, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. My gut would say if you're a back sleeper, just use 1 pillow. And maybe consult a sleep specialist. I don't know. Any other questions?
I have a question. So
Yeah.
when you were against the wall,
Mm-hmm.
your shoulders were against the wall, and then you said to put your neck against the wall.
Yeah.
I really felt the middle part of my skull against the wall. My neck was nowhere close to the wall. So
Yeah.
so now what?
No, you're touching on a good detail. So the back of your neck will not actually be against the wall. It's more the just so if the middle of your skull is like here, we're trying to get maybe just an inch or 2 below that to kind of lengthen up towards the back of the wall. And the natural curve of our neck will never actually straighten that all the way. But if this kind of base of the skull area feels really tight and it's like it's not moving, you can take your fingers, take 2 fingers on each hand, and start to pull out from the spine towards the ears along the base of the skull. And you can just regularly give yourself a little bit of a massage there. And that massage will start to release some of those muscles. You also, I would suggest probably doing some lateral, meaning side to side neck stretch. That will really open up some of these potentially tight back of the neck muscles. But again, be gentle with yourself, give it time. It doesn't happen overnight. And speaking from my experience, neck is the hardest thing for me. Shoulders and neck, they want to do what they want to do. So don't feel discouraged if you feel like today it didn't happen. It can change over time just through these gentle mobilizing with the fingers in that attachment area and then doing some gentle side stretching with the neck. Does that help a little bit?
Thank you. That's helpful. Can I ask another question?
Please do. Please do.
So do you find it to be more effective if people have a routine that they follow every day, or can you get significant benefit if you just do these little exercises whenever you think of them throughout the day, but you don't have like, oh, I did that 10 times, 4 times a day, that sort of thing? Like, do you have to keep count and track in order to know that you've done enough? Like, and then what's enough?
Of course, right? Excellent question. My response to that would be part of this whole challenge is like training our brain to hold us in these positions. Like if we are not used to being there, we're going to start falling more into what is habitual or what we're used to. So I think in terms of posture and alignment stuff, anytime throughout the day you can start noticing, oh my gosh, my head's way forward, or oh my gosh, I'm tipping in my pelvis. Take a second, try to find a more neutral position, reassess your posture, maybe do a triple S check-in at the wall, whatever is going to work for you to kind of find a better position, and then just continually do that throughout the day. Because so much of this is kind of our brains have to get used to something different, and that takes time. So I personally don't think there's a prescription of like, everyone has to do this 10 times a day, or it only counts if you did 15. No, it's anytime you can think about it and write yourself, you are doing good, honest, important work for your posture and for your body, I think. Now, for me, I kind of use like the exercise at the wall. when I'm working all day at my desk, I'll get up and use that as a check-in, and then I'll try to carry that with me for the rest of the afternoon while I'm sitting. So I kind of try to keep priming my mind by using the wall or by using the floor or a prop or something. So I use those more as tools and check-ins. But then, exactly as you said, every time I think or realize throughout the day something is going on that could be better, I do try to fix it. So I don't think you have to, you don't have to do 50 exercises X a day, but follow movement that feels good to you, and then just keep gently kind of seeking the most optimal position for your body throughout the day. And eventually you won't have to think about it as much. Our brains are very plastic in that way.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It was really interesting.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thanks for coming. I appreciate that. Any other questions? I am an open book. Thanks, Nicole. I'll stick around if you guys do have questions. I'm here. Otherwise, you're free to go. I really appreciate your time, willingness to dive into the nitty-gritty with me. I'm going to stop recording now. I hope you guys have a great rest of the week, rest of the month.
Thanks, Meredith. Bye.
Thanks, Emma.